Have you ever been accused of breaking the law on your own property? Imagine stepping outside your home, the one you've worked decades to earn, only to find flashing lights, an angry neighbor, and police questioning you because you parked in your own driveway. Sounds unbelievable, right? But that's exactly how my story began. The day Karen decided I was her next target. If you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare, you'll want to hear this one through to the end. It all started on a quiet Saturday morning in Maple Grove, the kind of suburban neighborhood that looked perfect from the outside. Manicured lawns, white fences, identical mailboxes, and a homeowners association that prided itself on order and harmony. What no one told me when I moved in was that harmony had a name, Karen Whitfield. She was the self-appointed queen of the HOA, a woman with a clipboard, a temper, and far too much time on her hands. Most neighbors had learned to stay out of her way. I didn't know that yet. I had recently retired from active service as a colonel in the US Army, after 24 years of discipline, leadership, and structure. Civilian life was supposed to be quiet, a chance to enjoy my home, my garden, and the sound of peace instead of command radios. My wife and I had picked Maple Grove because it seemed peaceful, somewhere to live without chaos. But on that morning, chaos came to my driveway. I'd parked my black SUV a few inches closer to the street than usual because I was unloading equipment from the back. Nothing unusual, nothing illegal. I didn't notice Karen watching from across the street, her eyes narrow like a hawk spotting prey. 10 minutes later, I heard the unmistakable sound of a police siren. When I walked back out, 2 officers were standing beside my vehicle, one hand resting casually on his belt. Karen stood a few feet away, arms crossed, pretending to look concerned. My first thought was that something serious had happened in the neighborhood. My second thought, unfortunately the correct one, was that this was about me. You could see it on her face. The satisfaction of someone who believed she'd caught a criminal. She pointed toward my car as if she'd just discovered contraband. "That vehicle," she told the officers, "is blocking the public walkway. He's violating HOA policy." I wanted to laugh, but the absurdity was too deep to find funny. I looked at the officers, calm and polite, introducing myself the way I always had, clear, respectful, and direct. But Karen wasn't done. She started lecturing them, quoting random HOA bylaws and claiming she had authority over parking regulations. One of the officers politely asked her to step back while they checked the situation. When they realized my SUV wasn't blocking anything, not even by an inch, they looked awkward. One officer turned to me and asked for my ID. Standard protocol, I understood. Without a word, I handed over my military ID. The moment his eyes dropped to the word colonel, the tone changed instantly. He looked up, nodded respectfully, and handed it back. "Thank you for your service, sir," he said quietly. Karen's expression froze. She hadn't expected that. Her confidence cracked just a little. But Karen was the type who didn't back down easily. She mumbled something about favoritism and abuse of power, storming back to her porch while filming the entire scene on her phone. I knew then this wasn't just a random complaint. It was the beginning of something worse. Some people get drunk on control, and Karen was addicted to it. Every inch of this neighborhood was her stage, and every homeowner her unwilling audience. After the police left, I stood for a while, staring at the driveway. Something about that moment stayed with me. In the military, conflicts had rules, chain of command, consequences. Out here, the battlefield was pettiness, gossip, and bureaucracy. And Karen was the general. I didn't want a war, but sometimes war finds you, even in suburbia. Over the next few days, I noticed little things. Karen walking slower past my house, taking photos of my lawn, jotting notes on her clipboard. One morning, I found an HOA violation slip taped to my mailbox for unsightly garden tools visible from the street. The tools were behind my fence. That's when I knew she wasn't going to stop. Neighbors began whispering to me in passing. "You're her new target," one said quietly. Another warned me, "She did the same thing to the Parkers. Fined them until they sold their house." I realized this wasn't about me at all. It was about control, and I'd unknowingly challenged the one person who couldn't stand being challenged. But I wasn't like the others. I'd faced insurgents, ambushes, and interrogation rooms. A suburban bully with a clipboard wasn't going to break me. What Karen didn't know was that while she was playing HOA politics, I was quietly building my own case. I documented everything, every complaint, every violation note, every photo she took. I wasn't planning on striking back yet, but I knew when the time came, I'd be ready. That night, as the streetlights flickered and the hum of quiet suburbia returned, I sat on my porch and thought about how easily power corrupts, even in the smallest places. Karen didn't see neighbors as equals. She saw them as subjects. But in trying to control me, she'd made her first mistake, underestimating who she was dealing with. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was the opening move of something much bigger. And as I looked down the street at Karen's perfectly lit porch and the silhouette of her pacing behind the curtains, I knew this battle had only just begun. If you've ever had a Karen in your life, you'll want to stick around for what comes next. Because this time, she picked a fight with the wrong neighbor and the wrong colonel. As the sun rose the next morning, the neighborhood looked calm and ordinary again. Yet the tension from the previous day lingered beneath the surface like smoke after a quiet fire. The story of Karen calling the police had spread through the suburban streets faster than wildfire. Whispers rippled through the cul-de-sacs. Some found it ridiculous, others quietly entertained. But none of them truly understood the depth of what had been set in motion. I, Colonel James Carter, had spent 22 years serving in the US Army. I'd seen chaos, command, and conflict in some of the toughest corners of the world. But never did I imagine my own driveway would become the battlefield of suburban politics. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, strutted around as if she were leading a campaign of righteousness. After the police left, she didn't apologize. Instead, she doubled down, warning others that I disrespected the rules and that even military men must obey her regulations. She posted on the HOA Facebook page, twisting the story to make herself the victim. According to her version, I had blocked emergency access, refused to cooperate, and threatened the safety of the neighborhood. I watched the comments grow overnight, a mix of support and outrage, until my name became the center of a neighborhood storm. But I didn't respond. Years of discipline taught me that silence can be more powerful than rage. Instead, I gathered facts. The following week, I quietly requested copies of the HOA bylaws, local property regulations, and my recorded rights as a homeowner. The truth was on my side, and I intended to prove it methodically. Karen, however, wasn't done. Every morning, she began taking photos of my property. My car parked at the edge of the driveway, my trash cans positioned an inch beyond the curb, even my mailbox height. She filed 3 separate violations in 2 days. The HOA board, clearly intimidated or influenced by her domineering personality, sent me formal warnings. I could see it in their tone. They were scared of her, but didn't dare to admit it. I remained calm, but deep inside, I felt the same controlled fury I used to feel before a mission. This wasn't about a driveway anymore. It was about power, control, and the principle of standing up against manipulation. One evening, as I was cleaning my garage, I noticed Karen standing at the end of her driveway, phone in hand, pretending to walk her dog. She recorded me again. I walked toward her, not in anger, but with the composure of a man who had faced far worse. I simply said, "You're on my property line, ma'am. Please step back." She scoffed, muttering something about documenting evidence. That night, I reviewed the HOA's rules once more. Every line, every clause. I realized that Karen had been exploiting the ignorance of others to maintain control. Her power was built on intimidation, not legitimacy. But what she didn't know was that I had already contacted an attorney, not to threaten her, but to understand every loophole she'd ever used against the neighborhood. Within days, I discovered several misuses of funds and illegal alterations to HOA policies that weren't voted on properly. Karen had essentially rewritten sections of the rules without legal backing. The pattern was clear. She had bullied others for years, collecting fines and controlling homeowners through fear. I knew then that this was bigger than my driveway. It was about justice for everyone who had fallen silent under her reign. But before I could take action, she escalated again. This time, she filed a complaint claiming my vehicle posed a safety hazard and demanded immediate towing. When I arrived home from work, a tow truck was already reversing toward my car. And that was the last straw. I walked straight up, showed them my property documents and my military ID. The driver froze, confused. Karen came running, furious, shouting about violations and authority. But when the officer accompanying the tow crew saw my credentials, his expression changed entirely. "Ma'am," he said to her, "you have no jurisdiction here." Karen's voice cracked, but she didn't back down. Instead, she stormed off, muttering that this wasn't over. I knew then. She was planning something bigger, something she thought could break me, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. The morning after the towing incident, the neighborhood felt unnervingly quiet, as if the calm before a storm had taken hold. I could feel it in the air, that same kind of tense silence I'd felt before missions overseas, where you knew the enemy was regrouping, waiting for the next strike. Only this time, my battlefield was a cul-de-sac lined with manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, and pastel-painted mailboxes. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was a decorated US Army colonel, a man who'd led soldiers through life-and-death missions. And yet here I stood, preparing for war against a suburban HOA tyrant named Karen Miller. She wasn't just stubborn, she was strategic. Every move I made, she countered with paperwork, manipulation, and carefully staged outrage. That morning, a formal notice appeared taped to my front door. A letter from the HOA board accusing me of creating a hostile environment and endangering community harmony. It was laughable, really. The letter accused me of intimidation because I displayed military identification in a confrontational manner. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. But the real danger wasn't in the words. It was in what they meant. Karen was turning my status as a military officer into a weapon against me, painting me as some kind of aggressive figure, misusing authority. The HOA board, spineless as they were, seemed to follow her lead blindly. That evening, I attended the scheduled HOA meeting, something I rarely did before. As I entered the small community centre, I noticed the murmurs quiet down. Eyes turned toward me, some curious, others sympathetic, and a few filled with quiet resentment. At the centre table sat Karen, flanked by 3 board members who looked more like hostages than colleagues. Her smile was thin, calculated. "Ah, Colonel Carter," she said with exaggerated politeness. "We're glad you could join us to discuss these ongoing issues." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I placed a thick folder on the table, documentation, legal references, and a copy of the HOA's original charter, dated years before Karen had seized control. "Before we begin," I said calmly, "I'd like to clarify the definition of authority." Her expression flickered. I explained, point by point, how her recent amendments were invalid without a community vote, how she'd violated state housing laws, and how her financial records showed suspicious discrepancies in HOA funds. I watched the colour drain from her face. The board members shifted uncomfortably, realising they might be complicit, but Karen wasn't one to surrender easily. "This is slander," she snapped. "You can't just accuse me." I interrupted her, not with anger, but with precision. "These aren't accusations, they're facts. And if necessary, I'll take them to county court." Her jaw tightened, and I could see it, that look of fear hidden behind arrogance. She knew she was caught, but pride wouldn't let her back down. Over the next week, things escalated quickly. I began receiving anonymous complaints. My trash bins weren't stored properly. My outdoor lights were too bright. My dog barked excessively. Each was a petty attempt to bury me in bureaucracy, but I kept every notice, documenting each one meticulously. At night, my security cameras caught Karen walking near my property, sometimes taking photos, other times talking quietly on her phone as she pointed toward my car and driveway. It was harassment, pure and simple. Then, one afternoon, as I returned from the base, I found a large orange notice pinned to my garage door. Final HOA warning. Property violation. Unapproved modifications. Apparently, the new mailbox I had installed months earlier, one that met every HOA standard, was suddenly deemed non-compliant. I almost admired her persistence. She was trying to provoke me into an outburst, something she could record or twist into evidence. But I had no intention of giving her that satisfaction. Instead, I quietly reached out to a local investigative journalist I knew from my years working with community veteran programs. I explained the situation, shared my documentation, and mentioned that several other homeowners had privately complained about Karen's bullying, but were too scared to speak up. The journalist agreed to look into it. Within days, whispers began to circulate. Neighbors started talking more openly. A retired couple down the street told me Karen once fined them $250 for having their Christmas lights up too long. Another resident revealed she'd been denied permission to repaint her house because the shade didn't fit Karen's taste. Slowly, her empire of intimidation began to crumble from within. But Karen wasn't done yet. Her next move was more public and far more reckless. She posted on the neighborhood Facebook group, accusing me of using my military background to threaten civilians. She claimed I was dangerous and unstable, even suggesting I was under investigation for misconduct. The comments exploded overnight. Dozens of people defending her, others questioning her sanity. My phone buzzed with notifications until I turned it off completely. The next morning, 2 local police officers knocked on my door. They explained they'd received multiple complaints about me brandishing a firearm near my property, a completely fabricated claim. I invited them in, calmly showed them my security footage from the previous 48 hours, and watched as their expressions turned from concern to disbelief. "Colonel," one of them said quietly, "you've got yourself a stalker." That was the turning point. The officers wrote up an official report documenting Karen's false claims. I sent a copy of that report, along with all other evidence, to my attorney. He reviewed it and said 6 words that made me realize this war was almost over. She's crossed into criminal territory now. That weekend, something unexpected happened. My neighbors began showing up at my door one by one. A single mom who'd been fined for a broken fence, a young couple charged for having too many guests. Even the board members, once loyal to Karen, started whispering apologies. I realized that standing up to her had given others the courage to do the same. Still, Karen tried one last desperate tactic. She filed a formal harassment complaint against me in small claims court, hoping to drag me into a public spectacle. But what she didn't know was that my attorney had already compiled every violation she'd committed, including misuse of HOA funds, document forgery, and defamation. The court date was set. The battle lines were drawn. I knew the next chapter wouldn't just determine the outcome of my conflict with Karen, it would expose everything she'd built her false authority upon. As I stood on my porch that evening, watching the sunset bleed into the horizon, I felt that familiar sense of focus I'd had before every operation. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about principle, about protecting the integrity of those who refused to be bullied, whether in uniform or behind a white picket fence. Karen thought she could manipulate a soldier with paperwork and gossip, but she was about to learn what happens when you push a man trained to defend what's right. The morning of the court hearing arrived with an eerie stillness that settled over the neighborhood like fog before a storm. I woke up early, not out of nervousness, but from instinct. The same kind that had always warned me before a mission went live. This wasn't a battlefield made of dirt and smoke, but one made of paper, lies, and manipulation. Yet the stakes felt just as real. Karen had spent weeks trying to drag my name through the mud, spreading rumors, weaponizing the HOA, even fabricating police reports. Today, she was about to face the consequences of every deceitful move she had made. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my uniform collar, not because the court required it, but because I wanted her to see what she'd been trying to destroy. A man who'd earned every medal through discipline, not intimidation. When I arrived at the courthouse, a few neighbors were already there, whispering and exchanging glances. Some nodded respectfully as I walked past. Others simply looked away, too afraid of Karen's wrath to take sides. But it didn't matter. By the end of the day, the truth would no longer be a matter of opinion. The courtroom was small, sterile, and cold. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table, dressed sharply in a beige suit, her hair pinned perfectly, and a smug expression plastered across her face. Her lawyer, a younger man with an air of arrogance, sat beside her, flipping through papers like he was about to win an easy case. Across the aisle, my attorney, a composed and razor-sharp woman named Rachel, greeted me with a confident nod. "We have everything we need," she whispered. The judge entered, and the tension snapped into silence. Karen's lawyer began with a performance that could have fooled anyone who hadn't lived through her chaos. He painted her as a concerned citizen, a dedicated HOA president who had merely tried to uphold community standards against an aggressive military officer who intimidated neighbors and defied regulations. His words flowed like poison dressed as honey. Karen sat beside him, nodding dramatically, occasionally dabbing at imaginary tears. When he finally rested his case, the courtroom was quiet. Then Rachel stood. Her tone was steady, but carried the kind of authority that didn't need volume to command attention. "Your Honor," she began, "this case isn't about community rules. It's about harassment, defamation, and abuse of power." She walked forward, placing a thick binder of evidence on the judge's desk. "Everything this woman has said is false, and we can prove it." One by one, Rachel presented the evidence. Photos, timestamps, and emails showing Karen's late-night visits near my property. Security footage showing her photographing my car, taking measurements of my fence, and pacing with her phone at midnight. Then came the financial documents. A breakdown of HOA funds that revealed thousands of dollars of unexplained maintenance expenses. Each exhibit hit like artillery fire. The judge flipped through the documents, frowning deeper with each page. Karen's face began to crack, the confident mask giving way to twitching nerves. When the judge asked her to explain the financial discrepancies, her voice faltered. I don't handle every transaction personally," she stammered, glancing desperately at her lawyer. "Our treasurer manages most of the accounts." "Then why?" Rachel interrupted smoothly. "Do these payments go directly into an account under your name?" The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Karen's lawyer tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a glare. "Sit down, counselor." What followed was a slow, painful unraveling of Karen's control. Every lie she had built, every false report, every fabricated violation, every whispered rumor began collapsing under the weight of evidence. Rachel revealed screenshots of Karen's Facebook posts labeling me as dangerous. She presented the police report proving that Karen had filed a false claim about me, brandishing a firearm. Even the responding officer had submitted a statement confirming it was fabricated. At that point, Karen stopped pretending to be the victim. Her composure disintegrated as she stood up, shouting over Rachel's presentation. "He's manipulating everyone. He thinks because he's a soldier he can do whatever he wants." The judge's gavel slammed down. "Mrs. Miller, sit down." But she didn't. Her voice rose, cracking under rage and desperation. "You all think he's a hero, but he's a bully. He's a liar. I was just trying to keep order." The judge ordered her to be seated again, warning her of contempt. When she finally slumped down, trembling with fury, I realized what had just happened. She'd destroyed her own case. After a long pause, the judge spoke in a firm, measured voice. "This court finds the defendant, Colonel Carter, not guilty of any wrongdoing. Furthermore, we find sufficient evidence suggesting that Mrs. Karen Miller engaged in harassment, defamation, and misuse of HOA authority." Karen's head snapped up in disbelief. "What?" The gavel struck again. "This case is dismissed. An investigation into Mrs. Miller's financial and administrative conduct within the HOA will be opened immediately." The sound of that gavel hitting wood might as well have been the sound of victory itself. For a moment the courtroom was still. Then the murmurs began. Neighbors whispering, reporters scribbling notes. Karen sat frozen, her once perfect posture now slumped in defeat. As I left the courthouse, she tried to meet my eyes, but I didn't give her the satisfaction. I walked past her calmly, the same way I had walked past enemies who had underestimated me before. Outside, the sunlight felt different, sharper, clearer, free. Rachel shook my hand firmly. "It's over," she said, smiling. "Not yet," I replied. "She still runs the HOA. For now." Because deep down, I knew people like Karen didn't stop. They regrouped. They found new ways to control. And as I drove home, past the quiet rows of houses, I knew this was only one battle in a longer war. But the tide had turned. For the first time, the neighborhood had seen her for what she truly was. And they'd seen me not as an aggressor, but as a man who stood his ground with integrity. I wasn't fighting just for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone she'd silenced. The next move would decide everything, and I was ready. The days following the confrontation were deceptively calm, the kind of calm that felt artificial, like the quiet before a storm that had been gathering in secret. Colonel Mason believed that after his military background had been revealed and Karen had been humiliated in front of the neighborhood and the police, the HOA would back down. But he underestimated their pettiness and the quiet influence Karen still held. Within a week, a letter arrived in his mailbox printed on official HOA stationery, accusing him of multiple violations: overgrown grass, unsanctioned vehicle parking, noise disturbances, and even disrespectful conduct toward HOA officials. It was absurd. Every line a weaponized version of bureaucracy, crafted to intimidate him into submission. Mason read it with a measured calm, though his blood boiled beneath the surface. He had faced adversaries more cunning, more dangerous, and more powerful than this suburban committee. Yet something about the smallness of their cruelty disgusted him deeply. The HOA, under Karen's vengeful whispering, had turned the machinery of neighborhood rules into a personal vendetta. The next day, as Mason walked outside, he could feel the shift in the air. Neighbors who once waved now looked away awkwardly, pretending not to notice him. Others, perhaps still loyal to Karen, or fearful of crossing the HOA, whispered behind closed blinds. The once friendly cul-de-sac had become an observation post, and Mason felt the weight of unseen eyes, judging every move he made. His truck, still parked neatly in his own driveway, was now labeled an unapproved commercial vehicle, even though it wasn't. A new HOA citation had been taped to his door. When he returned from his morning jog, he peeled it off slowly, a faint smile crossing his face. They wanted a reaction, but he wouldn't give them that satisfaction. He'd learned long ago in the military that discipline was the strongest weapon against chaos. However, Karen wasn't finished. At the next HOA meeting, she rallied her remaining supporters with dramatic flair, retelling her version of events: how Mason had threatened her, how his truck blocked the sidewalk, how she feared for her safety. Every sentence was twisted, rewritten with the precision of a manipulative storyteller. The crowd, half of whom hadn't even witnessed the incident, murmured with unease. Yet not everyone bought into her narrative. Some remembered her history of complaints, her obsession with control, her habit of bending the rules to fit her own desires. Still, the HOA board was hesitant to stand against her. Power, even petty power, is addictive, and Karen knew how to wield it with poison-tipped precision. Mason attended that meeting, sitting silently in the back, his presence a silent challenge. When Karen glanced his way and caught his calm, unshaken stare, her speech faltered for just a second. He didn't need to say a word. His composure spoke volumes. Later that night, Mason documented everything, every citation, every false claim, every recorded interaction. His military training made him meticulous. He knew that the best counterattack wasn't immediate aggression, but a well-prepared operation. He filed formal complaints with the city council, the police department, and even the HOA's oversight board. His goal wasn't revenge, it was exposure. If Karen wanted a battle, she was about to face one she couldn't control. But the HOA escalated. One morning, Mason awoke to find his mailbox smashed, the metal dented inward, and a crude message spray-painted across his fence: "Rules apply to everyone." The irony made him almost laugh. It was exactly the opposite of what Karen believed. He contacted the authorities, but the vandalism was subtle enough to avoid direct blame. He could feel Karen's smug satisfaction radiating from across the street. That night, he sat by his window, watching her house through the half-closed blinds. Her lights flickered on and off as she moved from room to room, her shadow crossing the curtains. There was something off about her obsession. It wasn't just authority. It was a desperate need to control what she couldn't understand. Mason began to dig deeper. Through public records, he found the HOA's financial statements and noticed irregularities, unexplained expenses, duplicate invoices, and funds approved without community votes. Karen, as HOA treasurer, had been signing off on all of it. Now the story was no longer about a blocked driveway. It was about corruption, power, and exposure. Mason gathered everything and sent the evidence anonymously to the homeowners through printed flyers left on doorsteps overnight. By morning, the entire neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Karen's influence began to crack. People demanded answers. Emergency meetings were called. For the first time, Karen was on the defensive. Mason didn't attend that one. He watched from his porch as neighbors crowded the community center, the same people who once looked away now demanding truth. He could hear fragments of shouting, the tone of betrayal echoing through the still night air. By the end of the week, Karen's control was slipping, but she wasn't going down quietly. A new HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday, and Mason knew that would be the tipping point. He prepared everything, every document, every recording, every time-stamped photo, ready to bring it all to light in front of everyone. But Karen wasn't finished scheming. She had one final move, something desperate and reckless, and Mason could sense it coming. He'd seen this pattern before in conflict zones. When a person in power feels cornered, they strike back with chaos. As he looked out at the quiet suburban street under the pale light of the moon, he realized this wasn't just about an HOA feud anymore. It was a battle of integrity versus control, truth versus manipulation. And Karen, even stripped of allies, was still dangerous. He could almost feel her eyes from across the street, hidden behind her blinds, planning her next move. The war was far from over. It was just beginning. The following week arrived heavy with anticipation, like the tense stillness before a decisive military strike. Colonel Mason knew this meeting would be the defining battle, the moment where truth would collide with Karen's carefully built facade of authority. The HOA had been spiraling since the neighborhood discovered the irregularities he'd anonymously exposed, and Karen's once iron grip on the community was slipping fast. Rumors spread faster than facts. Whispers of missing funds, secret votes, and backroom deals that painted her as both manipulative and corrupt. Mason had seen this before, though not in suburban America, in fragile governments abroad, where power was worshipped until accountability arrived, and now it had arrived at her doorstep. That Saturday morning, the air felt unusually crisp, the sunlight cutting sharp lines through the trees as Mason walked toward the community hall. He carried a black folder under his arm, thick with evidence, bank statements, meeting minutes, emails he had legally acquired through the Freedom of Information Act. The same discipline that guided him through years of service now directed every step of his civilian mission. Karen was already there, of course, standing by the entrance with her fake smile plastered on her face, greeting neighbors as if nothing was wrong. But her eyes, sharp and restless, betrayed her. She saw Mason approaching and stiffened slightly, pretending to straighten her clipboard. He walked past her without a word, his silence louder than any confrontation. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The chairs were filled, every seat occupied by residents who had lived under Karen's thumb for years. Mason took a seat near the center, observing quietly. The board members, once loyal to Karen, avoided her gaze. She called the meeting to order with forced cheer, but the tremor in her voice cracked the illusion of control. The first half hour dragged through minor agenda points, a delaying tactic Mason suspected to avoid the inevitable topic. But the crowd grew restless, muttering, until one neighbor finally stood and demanded answers. The tension snapped like a wire. Karen tried to dismiss the concerns, calling the financial discrepancies clerical errors, but Mason could see the panic building behind her eyes. That was his cue. He stood slowly, the room quieting almost instinctively. Years of command had given him a presence that didn't need raising his voice. He held up his folder and began laying out the evidence methodically. First the duplicate payments, then the misused funds, and finally the signatures that all traced back to Karen. Each document hit the metaphorical table like a bullet of truth. The murmurs turned into gasps, then into outrage. The illusion of Karen's moral superiority shattered in seconds. Her face flushed red, her hands trembled, and she began to shout over him, accusing him of harassment, conspiracy, anything she could grasp. But Mason didn't engage. He let the papers speak for themselves. Every homeowner could see the pattern, the years of manipulation hidden under the mask of enforcing community standards. Then, like clockwork, her temper erupted. She slammed her clipboard onto the table and began ranting about respect, order, and how Mason was destroying the neighborhood. It was the same tone of control that had made her infamous. But this time, no one backed her. The crowd turned cold, and her voice echoed in an empty chamber of her own making. When she realized she'd lost the room, something in her broke. She grabbed her things and stormed out, slamming the door so hard that it shook the glass. Mason remained standing, unflinching, until silence settled again. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply said, "The truth was overdue." After the meeting, neighbors approached him one by one, thanking him for exposing what they'd all quietly suspected. Some offered apologies for not standing up sooner, others were embarrassed that they had ever sided with her. Mason accepted it all with quiet humility. For him, this wasn't about victory, it was about restoring peace and fairness. But deep inside, he knew Karen wasn't finished. People like her never simply disappear. They retreat, regroup, and come back with venom. And he was right. That night, strange things began happening again. His trash cans were overturned, his car tires mysteriously deflated. Late at night, his motion lights flickered on, but no one was there. He'd fought in war zones, but this was psychological warfare. Suburban sabotage meant to wear him down. Mason installed cameras, reinforced his gates, and documented everything. But even as he tried to stay vigilant, fatigue began to creep in. Not physical fatigue, emotional. He had moved to this neighborhood for peace after a lifetime of discipline and duty. But Karen had turned that peace into a battleground. Days later, an unmarked envelope appeared in his mailbox. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of his truck parked in the same driveway that had started this entire feud, but this time with a note scrawled in red ink. "You don't belong here." No signature, but he didn't need one. He knew her handwriting, her pettiness. It was her final warning. But instead of fear, Mason felt resolve harden inside him like steel. He had seen bullies before, men with weapons, men with power, and none of them had ever won against patience and strategy. If Karen wanted another round, he was ready to end this war completely. A few nights later, the HOA's internal audit confirmed his findings. The board announced Karen's suspension pending investigation. Her access to HOA funds was revoked, her authority stripped. For most people, that would have been the end. But Mason knew better. He saw the look in her eyes as she stood in her yard that evening, watching him across the street. It wasn't defeat, it was hatred, a dangerous kind of hatred. The kind that festers in silence and waits for darkness to fall. The next morning, as the sun rose over the quiet cul-de-sac, Mason noticed something odd. Karen's car was gone, her driveway empty. The neighborhood seemed unusually still. He shrugged it off and went about his morning routine. Until a knock at his door came just before noon. A police officer stood there, asking if he owned the silver sedan parked at the far end of the street. Mason shook his head, and the officer explained that it had been found abandoned, with Karen's name on the registration. Mason felt a strange chill crawl up his spine. She wasn't done, not by a long shot. This wasn't just an HOA feud anymore. This was the calm before her final act of desperation. He closed the door and looked out across the street toward her empty house. The curtains were drawn, the porch light still on in daylight, and for the first time, the silence felt heavy, unnatural. Something was coming, and Mason could feel it deep in his instincts. The kind honed from decades of military service. Karen was planning something, and when she returned, it wouldn't just be about rules or revenge. It would be personal. The neighborhood had never been quieter, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that lives between lightning and thunder, thick and waiting to split open. Karen's disappearance had become the talk of every front porch and group chat. Some neighbors said she'd gone to stay with family. Others whispered she was hiding from legal trouble after Mason's exposure of the HOA scandal. But Mason knew better. He'd seen too many people retreat only to return with vengeance sharpened by humiliation. And Karen, with her obsession for control, was not the type to walk away quietly. He kept his cameras running, reviewed the footage each night, and waited for the storm he knew was coming. It began with small things again, too small to report, but enough to keep him alert. His mail went missing. The floodlights on his driveway flickered at odd hours. Once, he found deep scratches along the side of his truck, deliberate and angry. He documented everything, time-stamped it all, and filed quiet reports to the police, though they couldn't do much without direct evidence. His military instincts told him to stay calm, gather proof, and wait. But deep down, there was a growing frustration that even after all this time, after exposing her lies and corruption, he still couldn't find true peace in his own home. A week later, he got a call from Detective Harper, the officer who'd first responded when Karen had called the police on him months ago. Harper's tone was serious. "Colonel Mason," he said, "we've been tracking some strange reports around your area. Anonymous calls, false complaints, all linked to your address. We can't confirm who's behind them yet, but I think you should stay vigilant." Mason thanked him and hung up, the weight of the warning settling in his chest like stone. She was back, not in sight, but in motion, moving pieces behind the curtain like a general planning her counterattack. That night, he barely slept. Around 2 a.m., his motion sensor triggered, and the soft ping from his security app woke him instantly. The camera feed flickered on his phone, grainy but clear enough to show a figure near his truck. The person wore a hoodie, but the posture, the sharp gestures, he knew. It was Karen. She was crouching near the tire, something metallic in her hand. Mason didn't panic. He moved like the soldier he'd always been. Quiet, deliberate. He stepped outside with his flashlight and called out her name once, his voice low but commanding. She froze, then bolted, sprinting down the street into the dark. The next morning, the police arrived and found evidence: a knife dropped near the truck and a small vial of some corrosive liquid. Karen had crossed the line from harassment to criminal behavior. Harper promised they'd track her down, but Karen was nowhere to be found. Her phone was off, her house dark, her car abandoned miles away. It was as if she'd disappeared into thin air. For the next few days, the neighborhood lived in uneasy quiet, everyone locking their doors and avoiding late-night walks. Mason felt the strain of it, not fear, but exhaustion. He'd fought organized enemies and armed insurgents, but this was different. This was personal, petty, and poisonous. Then 3 days later, she reappeared. It was mid-morning when Mason saw her car pull up to her driveway again. She stepped out looking disheveled, eyes swollen, clothes wrinkled, her once proud posture slouched with anger. She avoided everyone's eyes as she walked to her porch, clutching a folder close to her chest. Mason watched from his window, his expression unreadable. He wasn't angry anymore. He was done. He'd won this war the moment he refused to stoop to her level. But Karen wasn't finished. That evening, she made her move. The HOA had scheduled an emergency meeting to appoint an interim president, and she showed up uninvited, demanding to be heard. The board tried to stop her, but she stormed in anyway, waving papers and shouting that she'd been framed. Mason attended quietly, sitting near the back. She pointed at him, screaming about conspiracies and corruption, claiming he'd hacked her emails, forged documents, and manipulated the entire neighborhood. Her voice cracked, her face red, her words slurring with desperation. It was the final unraveling of a woman who couldn't handle defeat. The board called security, and when the officers escorted her out, she shouted one last threat over her shoulder. "You'll regret this, Mason. You think you're safe, but I'll ruin you like you ruined me." The words hung heavy in the air, but Mason didn't flinch. He'd been threatened by far worse. Still, something about her tone stuck with him. The way she said it, not as a warning, but as a vow. That night, he checked his locks twice, reviewed every camera angle, and tried to convince himself it was over. But around midnight, the alarms went off. His phone vibrated violently, motion detected in multiple zones. The feed showed movement near the back of his property. He rushed to his window, and there she was, Karen, standing by the fence, clutching something in her hand. Before he could react, a flash of orange lit the darkness. She'd poured gasoline near his truck. He bolted outside, shouting for her to stop, and that's when the sirens erupted. His cameras had already triggered an automatic alert to the authorities. The police arrived within minutes, catching her before she could ignite the fire. The scene was chaotic, flashing lights, shouting neighbors, Karen screaming about injustice as they handcuffed her. Mason stood still, breathing heavily, the adrenaline pounding through his veins. She looked at him one last time, her face twisted with something between hatred and heartbreak, and whispered words he couldn't hear over the chaos. Then they took her away. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to heal. The HOA issued a formal apology to Mason, reinstated fairness in its operations, and even offered him a position on the board, which he declined. He didn't want control, he just wanted quiet. The story spread beyond the neighborhood, making local news. "Colonel exposes corrupt HOA president," the headlines read. Some called him a hero, others called it karma. Mason didn't care. All he wanted was peace, and at last he had it. Still, there were moments, quiet mornings when the wind rustled through the trees, that he thought he saw her shadow near the fence, or heard the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. Maybe it was just memory, maybe it was the echo of a battle that had gone on too long. But one thing was certain: Karen's obsession had destroyed her, while his discipline had saved him. And though the war was over, Mason knew one truth from his years of service that would always stay with him. Peace is never free. It's earned one hard lesson at a time. That night, the neighborhood gathered outside his home, not to gossip, but to celebrate quietly. People brought food, coffee, and even small gifts of gratitude. "You saved us all from her tyranny," an elderly neighbor said, smiling through tears. Mason only nodded, offering a small smile. "No," he replied softly. "I just stood my ground." They stayed together until late, sharing stories of Karen's past antics and laughing in disbelief that they'd lived under her rule for so long. The tension that once hung over Maple Grove finally lifted, replaced by warmth and the sound of children playing freely again. Weeks turned into months. The HOA was restructured entirely, and new board members were elected democratically. They even implemented Mason's suggestion, installing community transparency laws that required all financial and disciplinary actions to be public. It was the kind of change that would have driven Karen mad, but it was also the kind of change that ensured no one like her could rise again. Mason finally started to live the life he'd dreamed of when he bought the house. Quiet mornings on the porch, his old Labrador lying by his feet, the American flag gently waving in the breeze. But even peace has ghosts. One afternoon, he received a letter from the correctional facility where Karen was serving her sentence. For a long while, he didn't open it. When he finally did, it wasn't the venom he expected. Her handwriting was shaky but clear. "Colonel Mason," it began, "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I lost myself trying to control everyone else. You reminded me what real strength looks like. Maybe one day I'll find a way to live with that." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was enough. Mason folded the letter neatly and placed it in his drawer. That chapter was closed. Years later, the story of the HOA colonel became a quiet legend in the area. New families moved in, never meeting Karen but hearing her name like a myth. The woman who went too far and the soldier who stood firm. The neighborhood thrived again. Mason attended community meetings occasionally, but mostly kept to himself. He didn't need recognition. The satisfaction came from seeing Maple Grove finally living up to its name, a place of order, peace, and simple life. On the anniversary of that final night, the night Karen was arrested, Mason stood at his window, looking out at the street lit softly by lampposts. He saw children riding bikes, a couple walking their dog, neighbors chatting by their driveways, and for the first time, he felt that deep, unshakable calm that soldiers rarely find after war. This was home, not a battlefield, not a mission, but a life, he whispered quietly, almost to himself. Mission complete. And as the last light of day faded into the warm glow of evening, the colonel finally rested. Not as a soldier, not as a victim, but as a man who had earned his peace the hard way. The story of Karen and the HOA would live on as a warning, a tale of control gone mad and dignity standing firm. But for Mason, it wasn't a story anymore. It was over. The battle was fought, the lesson learned, and the home, at long last, was his again. Have you ever been accused of breaking the law on your own property? Imagine stepping outside your home, the one you've worked decades to earn, only to find flashing lights, an angry neighbor, and police questioning you because you parked in your own driveway. Sounds unbelievable, right? But that's exactly how my story began. The day Karen decided I was her next target. If you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare, you'll want to hear this one through to the end. It all started on a quiet Saturday morning in Maple Grove, the kind of suburban neighborhood that looked perfect from the outside. Manicured lawns, white fences, identical mailboxes, and a homeowners association that prided itself on order and harmony. What no one told me when I moved in was that harmony had a name, Karen Whitfield. She was the self-appointed queen of the HOA, a woman with a clipboard, a temper, and far too much time on her hands. Most neighbors had learned to stay out of her way. I didn't know that yet. I had recently retired from active service as a colonel in the US Army, after 24 years of discipline, leadership, and structure. Civilian life was supposed to be quiet, a chance to enjoy my home, my garden, and the sound of peace instead of command radios. My wife and I had picked Maple Grove because it seemed peaceful, somewhere to live without chaos. But on that morning, chaos came to my driveway. I'd parked my black SUV a few inches closer to the street than usual because I was unloading equipment from the back. Nothing unusual, nothing illegal. I didn't notice Karen watching from across the street, her eyes narrow like a hawk spotting prey. 10 minutes later, I heard the unmistakable sound of a police siren. When I walked back out, 2 officers were standing beside my vehicle, one hand resting casually on his belt. Karen stood a few feet away, arms crossed, pretending to look concerned. My first thought was that something serious had happened in the neighborhood. My second thought, unfortunately the correct one, was that this was about me. You could see it on her face, the satisfaction of someone who believed she'd caught a criminal. She pointed toward my car as if she'd just discovered contraband. "That vehicle," she told the officers, "is blocking the public walkway. He's violating HOA policy." I wanted to laugh, but the absurdity was too deep to find funny. I looked at the officers, calm and polite, introducing myself the way I always had, clear, respectful, and direct. But Karen wasn't done. She started lecturing them, quoting random HOA bylaws and claiming she had authority over parking regulations. One of the officers politely asked her to step back while they checked the situation. When they realized my SUV wasn't blocking anything, not even by an inch, they looked awkward. One officer turned to me and asked for my ID. Standard protocol, I understood. Without a word, I handed over my military ID. The moment his eyes dropped to the word Colonel, the tone changed instantly. He looked up, nodded respectfully, and handed it back. "Thank you for your service, sir," he said quietly. Karen's expression froze. She hadn't expected that. Her confidence cracked just a little. But Karen was the type who didn't back down easily. She mumbled something about favoritism and abuse of power, storming back to her porch while filming the entire scene on her phone. I knew then this wasn't just a random complaint. It was the beginning of something worse. Some people get drunk on control, and Karen was addicted to it. Every inch of this neighborhood was her stage, and every homeowner her unwilling audience. After the police left, I stood for a while, staring at the driveway. Something about that moment stayed with me. In the military, conflicts had rules, chain of command, consequences. Out here, the battlefield was pettiness, gossip, and bureaucracy. And Karen was the general. I didn't want a war, but sometimes war finds you, even in suburbia. Over the next few days, I noticed little things. Karen walking slower past my house, taking photos of my lawn, jotting notes on her clipboard. One morning, I found an HOA violation slip taped to my mailbox for unsightly garden tools visible from the street. The tools were behind my fence. That's when I knew she wasn't going to stop. Neighbors began whispering to me in passing. "You're her new target," one said quietly. Another warned me. She did the same thing to the Parkers, fined them until they sold their house. I realized this wasn't about me at all. It was about control. And I'd unknowingly challenged the one person who couldn't stand being challenged. But I wasn't like the others. I'd faced insurgents, ambushes, and interrogation rooms. A suburban bully with a clipboard wasn't going to break me. What Karen didn't know was that while she was playing HOA politics, I was quietly building my own case. I documented everything, every complaint, every violation note, every photo she took. I wasn't planning on striking back yet, but I knew when the time came, I'd be ready.